right, hello everyone. It's nice to see so many of you joining us tonight. I'm April Cushing. I'm one of the Adult Services Librarians at the Norwood Library. We're very happy to have Allison Neff here with us tonight. Allison is the former program coordinator of the Fairbanks House in Dedham, which, as you probably know, is the oldest wood-framed structure still standing in North America. Allison is going to tell us tonight about an intriguing murder that happened in 1801. Involved a member of the Fairbanks family. Why don't we just get started? It's great to have you here tonight, Allison. We're looking forward to hearing your story. Welcome.
Thank you, April. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Yes, as April said, so I previously was the program coordinator at the Fairbanks House, and when I heard about this mystery of history, I was super intrigued, so I did a lot more research into it, and it's just one of those, you know, historical stories that maybe some of you have heard about it, but not that many people know all the details. And they're very, very interesting details, in all fairness. So my own background, I have a background in history education, doing educational program coordinating. I used to teach middle school history, so you know, this is kind of my passion. So tonight we're going to be talking about Jason Fairbanks. Now, Fairbanks, if the name isn't familiar, the Fairbanks House is in Dedham, Mass. It is the oldest wooden structure still standing in North America. Amazing historic site. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't. I know they've got a great virtual tour right now, and hopefully the inside of the house will be open again, you know, once the world makes sense again. But we're going to talk about a member of the Fairbanks family from a couple hundred years ago. So let me share my PowerPoint. Okay. And let me, if you have questions, I'll have time for questions at the end. I'll absolutely will take questions. But if you have a burning question right in the middle that you want to ask right away, you can put it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it, or April will let me know if people are writing things. So we're going to talk about Jason Fairbanks and the death of Elizabeth Fales. This is a mystery and a scandal of Dedham. So a little bit of background. Jason Fairbanks is obviously a Fairbanks member. So the Fairbanks family, Fairbanks house was built by Jonathan and Grace Fairbanks in 1637. And they had 6 children. The firstborn John got the house, who then they went to his son Joseph, which went to his son Joseph, which went to his son Joseph. They really liked the name Joseph. And Joseph, the third Joseph, he wasn't Joseph the third, his name was just Joseph, but he is the third Joseph, sold the house to his younger brother, Ebenezer. Ebenezer has a son, Ebenezer. So Ebenezer is the father of Jason Fairbanks. Ebenezer Jr. is his brother. So this is the generation we're talking about here. All right, so it's son of Ebenezer, brother of Ebenezer Jr. in terms of who owned the Fairbanks house at this time in history. And he did live in the Fairbanks house. He was born in 1780. This all takes place in 1801. He's not yet 21. He's just under, so he's 20 years old. Now, important thing to know about Jason. He was vaccinated for smallpox as a child. Vaccinations back then were not as good as they are now, and he sadly caught smallpox from the vaccination, which was rare but did happen. Because he then had smallpox, he was treated with mercury. And of course, now we would say, I don't think it's a good idea to treat you with mercury, but back then they thought mercury was a really good treatment. So he had mercury treatments, which caused him, probably somewhat having the smallpox as well as the mercury treatments, caused him to have a very weak constitution. He was very sickly. He was often, you know, very pale and gaunt. His right arm from the elbow down was immovable. It was completely stiff. He could move his hand, but he couldn't move his arm around. So it was a completely stiff right arm, elbow to wrist. And so it was kind of held in a frozen position against him. He couldn't bend the elbow. So he was always very sickly and really unable to do any sort of manual labor, got frequent headaches, struggled quite a bit in terms of physically. So Dedham in 1801 in general. So here's a map, and hopefully you can see my cursor here. This here, East Street and Willow Street, now called Eastern Ave. I guess actually Eastern Ave wasn't there yet. It would have been over here somewhere, but Fairbanks house was around here. Okay. Now you see here A. Wentworth, W. Fales. This is the Fales house down here. For those of you who are familiar with Dedham now, that property is right across from the Endicott estate on East Street. So it's, not even a mile, half a mile maybe from the Fairbanks house. So close neighbors with a few other property owners in between. So again, Fairbanks are over here. Here's the Fales. We're going to hear a lot about Mason's pasture. The climactic event happened in Mason's Field. Mason's Field, we don't know precisely where it is. We know it's about 400 yards away from the Fales property, further down East Street. So somewhere around here, possibly where East Street meets Rustcraft Road area, but we don't have that exactly. At this time, the Fairbankses are prominent prominent Dedham citizens. So the Fairbanks, Jonathan Fairbanks, the original founder, builder of the house, he was the first, they were the first family admitted into Dedham after the founders of Dedham. They were not a founding family, but the very next family. And there were only like 30 founding families. So they were there at the very beginning. And they are a well-off family. They are well respected. So everyone knows them, and they are generally well respected in town. Now, at this time, Ebenezer Sr. is still living there, obviously, and he has a bunch of his kids. Ebenezer Jr., his son, is also living there, but he is an adult with a wife and kids of his own. So if you're aware of the Fairbanks house, it's made of a main house with a couple wings. This is around the time that the East Wing is added because there are 12 to 15 family members living there. So even with the wing added, I think it was not a lot of space for a lot of people, but you had basically two families there because while his oldest son, Ebenezer Jr., was an adult, Ebenezer Sr. did still have younger kids. And so Jason was still living there also. But the Fairbanks are suffering a little bit of reputation trouble at this time because of Benjamin Fairbanks, who is Jason's uncle, another brother of Ebenezer Sr. So, and this isn't directly related to the whole Jason issue, but it's important to understand why public opinion of the Fairbanks public opinion may have turned against them more easily because there was already some resentment. Because of these sedition acts. The sedition acts were passed under President John Adams. The sedition acts basically made it so that you weren't allowed to speak out against the government, which you may recognize as being literally the opposite of the First Amendment. When Thomas Jefferson becomes president, the first thing he does is get rid of them and pardon everyone who was convicted under the sedition acts because most people agreed that that was not fair. But Benjamin Fairbanks and a friend of his put up a flag on the Liberty Pole in Dedham that says "Down with John Adams." And that is directly against the Sedition Act. So he, meaning Benjamin, and his friend are both arrested. Now, Benjamin is a Fairbanks. He comes from a wealthy family who is well respected and everyone knows them. And he is sentenced with the lightest sentence ever given under the Sedition Acts. While his friend, who is a nobody without a prominent family and without any resources, is given the heaviest sentence ever given under the Sedition Act. So the friend is given 30 years in prison and a $500 fine, where Benjamin Fairbanks is given 6 hours in prison and a $50 fine. Not even sure what the point is of sending someone to prison for 6 hours. I mean, basically, as soon as you check them in, they're gone. So they had the exact same crime. They committed it together. People felt like Benjamin got away with something. And so there was already a little bit of a, oh, you know, those Fairbanks always trying to get away with things. So while it's not like the entire town was against them, keep in mind there was some public opinion problems at the time. Now, the Fales family, remember the person who was murdered is Elizabeth Fales. The Fales family actually comes over originally to this country with the Fairbanks. There's a member of the Fales family is an indentured servant to Jonathan Fairbanks. But that indentured servitude ends within his lifetime, and the Fales family is set up as, again, a respected family, not as well off, not as prominent as the Fairbanks, but they are a stable presence in town. They're no longer indebted to the Fairbanks in any way. And in fact, there's a Fairbanks and a Fales who are married at this time. It's, I think, an aunt of Jason's is married to a Fales. So I can only imagine that after a Fairbanks was accused of murdering a Fales, I don't know, their marriage may have had some tense moments, I assume. But it makes things complicated. So the big thing here is what happened. And obviously we can never know for sure. And we have to kind of try to piece things together. Here are the things that we know for a fact that everyone agrees upon, there's no debate. Jason and Elizabeth, who was usually called Betsy, who was 18 years old, were both in William Mason's field on Monday, May 18th. So Monday, May 18th is when everything goes down. At around 3 p.m., Jason shows up at the Fales house, and he is badly wounded. He has stab wounds, he has cuts, there's a slice across his throat, though it isn't super deep. He has a terrible stomach wound that is really quite serious, and he almost dies from that stomach wound. So he is very badly injured. Betsy is still in Mason's field, mortally wounded. After Jason comes to the Fales residence, Betsy's father and uncle run, he says something to the effect of Betsy needs help. They run to the field, they find her, and she is also wounded. She has stab wounds all over. She has a stab wound in her back. Her throat is cut deeply enough that her windpipe is severed. So she's in even worse shape. And she dies within, I think, about 15 minutes of her uncle and father arriving. Jason is arrested for the murder. He is tried, he is convicted, and then he is hanged. And a little asterisk here, yes, hanged is correct. A picture is hung, a person is hanged. They are actually separate terms. You actually would not say that a person was hung, a person was hanged. That's my little grammar-obsessed voice in my head telling everyone needs to know that. So, those are the things that everyone agrees on, the basic timeline. But let's talk about the trial. This trial was fascinating because, first of all, keep in mind, this is 1801. There's no photography, there's no forensic evidence. So everything is hearsay. By the time you get to the trial, Elizabeth's body has already been buried. So it's only reports of what people saw. You don't have the body or pictures of the body to look at. And so the trial is pretty much just the prosecution and the defense each putting forward their perspective, what they think happened, and trying to support that. But there's a lot of strange inconsistencies. So a lot of what's here, you'll find some of it seems a little repetitive, but it's because I've mostly focused on sharing the things that were people argued about, where certain wounds were located, what certain things could have been done, because these are things that could cause reasonable doubt in a trial. So with that started, that said, we'll get started. The trial is presided over by 4 judges. There's the prosecution, the defense. Defense is notable because Harrison G. Otis is a relative of James Otis, the founding father. And there are 12 jurors who are all male. At this time, women cannot vote. They won't be able to vote for another 120 years. And so they cannot serve on juries either. So it's all male jurors. I will say the language is paraphrased and modernized by me to make it easier for everyone to understand. When there are statements that are exact, they are in quotation marks. If it's not in quotation marks, you can assume it's probably, being paraphrased. The transcript is known to be incomplete, the court's transcript, but we have what we have of it, and it is supposed to be most of it. I think the people who made the court transcript kind of left out some of the things they didn't feel were important, but we have most of it. So, the Attorney General, which I write just as ATTR Gen, for brevity, starts off by giving a description of Jason, that he confirms he's lost use of his arm. He has been at school more than laboring lads commonly were. Even with schooling, he had lived an indulged and idle life. The Attorney General does not have a good impression of Jason. He was fond of the deceased, and Jason thought he wasn't allowed at her father's house, so he and Elizabeth would meet elsewhere. There was no evidence that Elizabeth wanted to marry Jason, and Jason was very jealous of others and had threatened revenge against Elizabeth's parents. The threatening revenge against her parents is a main point in the prosecution's statements. So the fact that Jason had made threats against her parents is one of their main pieces of evidence. He goes on, and he says, on Saturday, May 16th, Jason told two people he was to meet Elizabeth where he would, quote, settle the affair, meaning she would consent to go to Wrentham to marry him or he would violate her chastity. At this time, they would have to have left town to get married, and Wrentham, they would have been able to do it in Wrentham. Kind of, people, go to Vegas for a quickie wedding, something, right now. Back then, you could go to Wrentham for your wedding that your parents didn't approve and that you didn't have to have the intent of marriage published in the local newspaper and all that jazz. Jason had threatened before, again, that she would marry him or he would take what he wanted from her, but then he always relented and said it would be wrong to ruin her character as revenge against her parents. But on Sunday, May 17th, he convinced a young woman to create a false document from the town clerk's office purporting to be a certificate of his having been duly published to Elizabeth Fales. Published meaning back then, if you were going to get married, the intention of marriage had to be published in the local newspaper. So you couldn't just get a marriage license. You had to intent to be published. And so the Attorney General, the prosecution is saying that he got his hands on a fake marriage certificate. On Monday morning, the 18th, he told a man he was going to Mason's pasture to meet Elizabeth. And then this same man saw Jason on his way there, spoke with him, and Jason told him he would return in an hour and let him know how it all went. So this is a friend of Jason's, and Jason is saying, oh, I'm gonna go, meet my girlfriend. I'll let you know how things went when I get back. And there is some proof that Jason had hired a horse and carriage for that week to go to Wrentham. Jason also asked several different people, including William Mason himself, who owned the field, if there would be anyone working there that afternoon, and Mason said no. Elizabeth, healthy, cheerful girl, her usual happy self, no signs of distress, no melancholy, anything like that. She had plans to go to some friends' houses in the afternoon, Earlier in the afternoon, she went to Mrs. Guild's and stayed till 2. At 3, just after 3, Elizabeth's mother sees Jason walk up to the Fales residence covered in blood and holding a bloody knife. So it is the events that happen between 2 and 3 p.m. that are up in the air, that no one but Jason and Elizabeth knew what happened in that hour. Nehemiah Fales, who is Betsy's father, and Samuel Fales, Betsy's uncle, ran to Mason's pasture and find her alive but severely wounded and barely breathing. And she died within a few minutes of their arrival. Jason's coat and his pocketbook, a little satchel, were found near her body. The fake marriage certificate mentioned, was in pieces by her feet. Her shoes and her shawl were off and a few feet from her, but her clothing was undisturbed otherwise. Now I say undisturbed in quotation marks because there were holes in him where there were stab marks. I mean, that's, but it wasn't that her clothing had been torn off. It didn't look like she had been hastily dressed or anything. Her clothes were all on her appropriately. There were just mars in the clothing where there were mars on her body. The knife Jason was holding, the bloody knife, had been borrowed from Mr. Hardy. Betsy's wounds matched that knife. She had been carrying nothing sharp. So it seems logical that the wounds were made by that knife. And also, the Attorney General says 2 young women had heard sounds of distress. They identified as Betsy Fales around 3 p.m. They said the sounds lasted for about 15 minutes, but they did not approach. The Attorney General then gives a long speech about the importance of being impartial and what reasonable doubt means in a court case. The Attorney General really likes to hear himself speak. This is a man who enjoys pontificating about everything. So it goes on for quite a while. He says, Jason's words upon arrival at the Fales house cannot be used for or against him, only his appearance and wounds. Now, this is important. In 1801, this is fairly common, that a defendant is not allowed to give statement in his trial because the prisoner is never given an evidence in his own favor unless some part of the same story is given in evidence by the government against him. So in other words, Jason is not allowed to testify on his own behalf unless the prosecution wants to use that same testimony against him. So he can't speak for himself for the defense unless the prosecution wants him there, which it doesn't seem quite fair, but it's how it was. So Jason never actually takes the stand. The prosecution witnesses. And before we get into the witnesses, let me just note that I do switch a little bit sometimes between first person and third person, or present tense versus past tense. That's just a product of me trying to translate everything into modern words that everyone will understand easily. So just keep that in mind, and I apologize for any inconsistencies. I've also skipped witnesses who are really just confirming known facts, things that everyone agrees on, like where Elizabeth was found, the fact that Jason was sickly, all these things that everyone agrees on. There's no need to list all the witnesses, just confirming them. And lastly, if at any point in this it says someone confirms something, that means it's not their words, it's the lawyers asking, did such and such happen, or did you do such and such? And then the witness just agreeing to that. So confirms means it's the lawyer's words, they are just agreeing to them. So we'll start off with Dr. Nathaniel Ames. Now, again, those of you familiar with Dedham may know the Ames house on High Street. That was Dr. Nathaniel Ames's residence. He was a very prominent member of Dedham society, and he also is the person where we get a lot of our information about historical Dedham from. This man wrote down everything. He kept a diary. He wrote the weather each day. He wrote, everyone in Dedham who was born, who died, who did what, who visited. I mean, this man kept records of everything, which is amazing for us because that is where we know a lot of the Dedham day-to-day things in history from. However, it is known Dr. Ames was not very fond of the Fairbanks family. He was not their doctor. Their family doctor was Dr. Kittredge, who you will see later as a defense witness. And whereas, he'll go on for pages about, someone who was born or a couple who got married or whatever. When it comes to the Fairbanks, he's kind of just like, yeah, Fairbanks did something today, whatever. He's very brief about them because he doesn't like them. He lists Elizabeth's wounds. And so you can read them here. She had a lot of different wounds. The main ones to focus on are the last two. A wound in her left thumb and a stab wound in her upper central back. All the other wounds are pretty much agreed upon. It is those two wounds, the thumb and the stab wound, that there's a lot of debate about. The stab wound, because if she's stabbed in the back, then doesn't that make it seem like Jason is automatically guilty? But you can see at the bottom there, he does confirm it is physically possible for the back wound to be self-inflicted. They did check and they did find out that a person could physically stab themselves in the back the way she had been stabbed. He also confirms the wound is on her left thumb, because that becomes one of the main inconsistencies in the case. It seems silly to care about a thumb wound, but it was just an example of how much disagreement there was between witnesses and how, it's all hearsay. They don't have photographs or the body there. Samuel Fales, Betsy's uncle, says, when Jason showed up at the Fales house, I told my son to hold him until help arrives, and then I went with Nehemiah to Betsy. I turned her over, asked if she knew what hurt her. She made signs that she did. And her father asked if she wanted water, and she indicated yes. So she made signs that she knew what hurt her, but did not gesture to anyone. She was unable to speak because of the very deep cut in her throat. So again, she says she knows what, but she never made any indication of to who or what it was. Dr. Jonathan Wild says, I viewed Elizabeth's wounds, did not examine closely, and confirms with certainty the wound is on her right thumb. Now, if we go back, you'll recall the wound is on her left thumb here, but now this doctor says with certainty the wound is on the right thumb. He says the wounds on her left wrist may have made her unable to use that arm to resist attack. So possibly part of why Jason was able to injure her was because of these wounds on her wrist. Samuel Fales is called up again, confirms he does not remember a wound on the right thumb. There is a wound on the left thumb, but it was older. It was wrapped up and not bleeding. It was from days ago. And also he's unaware of any relationship between Betsy and Jason. And they're asking everyone because there's also a lot of debate on whether Betsy and Jason were actually courting, were they just friends, did they barely know each other? Everyone's kind of got something different to say about that. Eunice Lewis, the wounds are in the right arm, not the left. The wound is on the right thumb. It's not wrapped, it's freely bleeding. And Betsy and Jason were good friends. So even, these are still prosecution witnesses and they're already disagreeing with each other. Dr. Abijah Draper says he saw teeth marks on her hand. Now, one other person mentions teeth marks, but that's it. None of the other doctors, no one else talking about the thumb wounds say anything about teeth marks. So we're not even sure if those were there or not. Ephraim Handy lived with the Fairbanks as a servant. It was his penknife that Jason had borrowed. Back then you had to carve pens, sharpen pens manually with a knife, and that's what this type of knife was for. And the tip was already broken. We know that she was stabbed with the bloody knife that Jason was holding that she was stabbed with had a broken tip. Ephraim Handy says the tip was already broken. Jason appeared normal and cheerful that morning, and he didn't know of any intimacy between Jason and Betsy, but he wasn't completely sure. Now, let's see here. Betsy's mother, unaware of any attachment for Jason from Betsy. Unsurprisingly, most of the prosecution witnesses are saying, oh yeah, they barely knew each other. Betsy's sister, Polly, she says, I went to the Fairbanks house with Betsy last week, the week before the murder. Betsy exhibited familiarity with the house and with Jason. When they got there, Betsy threw pebbles at a specific window that she knew was Jason's window. So he came to the door and let them in. So Betsy knew the house well enough to know which window was Jason's, that he would come to the door if she threw pebbles at it. She says Betsy went up, Polly says that Polly herself went upstairs with Suki, who is Jason's niece, and left Betsy and Jason alone together. But she never thought Betsy was fond of Jason or that he was courting her. I'm not really sure how you can leave them alone together for a couple hours and go with her knowing that she knows where his bedroom window is and to throw rocks at it and then say they hardly knew each other, but make of that what you will. So Suki is Jason's niece, but she is an adult. She is Ebenezer Jr.'s daughter, but Ebenezer Jr. is enough older than Jason that he has adult children. She tells the story of how that certificate, that fake marriage certificate, came to be. She said it was innocent, it was in a laughing manner, and Jason did not give Betsy's name. So, according to her, the story of the oft-mentioned fake certificate, she says she was sitting at her writing table with a pen, and Jason asked her to write him something. She said, "What?" Jason said, "Anything you please. You may write me a certificate. I have not seen one for so long, I've forgotten the form." Suki responded, "Whose name should I put in?" And Jason said, "Any of the Dedham girls." Suki said, "I will put Betsy Fail's name." Jason said, "That will do." So she said it was given away kind of that she knew Jason liked Betsy. So she said, "Who should I put in?" He said, "Oh, any Dedham girl." And it was kind of a, "Oh, well, I'll put in Betsy, shall I? I know you like her." So she claims that Jason was not the one who requested Betsy's name. She offered it. She writes it. Jason takes it and says, "Ah, Betsy Fails. That will do." Suki asks for it back, says, that's not, it's technically a forgery. And Jason says, no, I want to keep it, but I promise I won't show anyone. It'll just be between us. Okay. Dr. Benjamin Turner. He's the other one who mentions maybe there are teeth marks on the right hand. Oh, and there's definitely teeth marks below the thumb on the left hand. So now there are maybe teeth marks on both sides. And then also she has wounds on her right and left thumb. That cursed thumb, it's really. Betsy's father says he never forbade Jason from coming to the house. Jason said he wasn't welcomed at the Fails house, but he claimed he never said that. Jeremiah Shuttleworth, the wound is on the left thumb. Now, Hannah Farrington and her sister are the ones who heard Betsy's cries. Around 3 p.m., she heard Betsy's voice crying, "Oh dear, oh dear." She heard this 2 or 3 times in the span of 10 to 15 minutes, and they seemed to be sounds of distress. But she mentioned that Jason and Betsy were very fond of each other, often at the Farrington house together, cared deeply for each other, were courting, etc. Now, looking at this, my immediate thought is if you heard your friend saying, oh dear," repeatedly over the course of 10 to 15 minutes and sounded like she was in distress, would you not go check that out and try to help her? But Hannah and her sister said that they were expecting Elizabeth to come visit their house later that afternoon, so they didn't go to check on her then, despite the cries of distress. Prudence agrees, but she says she thought the sounds were laughter, but later knew them to be sounds of distress. Is later, during that 15 minutes, is later, after she knew about that Elizabeth was dead, we're not told. She thought Betsy planned on coming to the house, so didn't go to her, and Betsy and Jason were fond, they were courting, often together. Isaac Whiting. Last December, Jason mentioned difficulty courting Betsy as her friends are against him. He didn't think he would ever get to marry her because of difficulties between the families. And he talked about sacrificing her character but not wanting to hurt her, But Isaac said he was definitely joking when he said that, and that Jason and Betsy were on intimate terms. Now we get to Abner Whiting. Oh, Abner. So here's the thing about Abner Whiting. He becomes the prosecution's main witness. His testimony is the most damning of all of them. But the Whiting family does not like Jason. I will say, if you go back, Isaac Whiting is a friend of Jason's. We don't know if he is a different family. I don't know if he's a member of this Whiting family of Dedham who doesn't agree with his family, or if this is a different Whiting family. I'm not clear on that. All other members of the Whiting family definitely seem to have it out for Jason. The Whiting family at this time is an up-and-coming family. They're trying to stabilize themselves in Dedham. They're trying to get a little more wealthy, and they certainly would have seen the Fairbanks family as competition. Abner claims 2 to 3 years ago in Mr. Bates's shop with Jason, Mrs. Fales walked by and Jason cursed and swore he would have satisfaction of her. And then according to Bates, so Abner saying Bates says, Jason went home with Betsy one night and the door was shut against him. As in, Jason walked Betsy to her home and the Fales would not let him in. Bates at this time is dead, so he can't confirm this. But the next time in Bates's shop, the same time Betsy walks by, Abner asks Jason about his previous comments and Jason says, oh no, I never meant that. And then he mentions a third time that he was in Bates' shop and someone walked by and he asked Jason something, but it wasn't really, relevant to the conversation, to the trial. But also, how odd that every time Jason left his house in the past 3 years, Abner somehow was there and always knew exactly what he said. Clearly, I'm a little skeptical of Abner just, oh yeah, every time Jason walked into Mr. Bates' shop, I just happened to be there. Reuben Farrington. Betsy and Jason often walked home together. Jason said he's going to meet Betsy and violate her chastity or carry her to Rentham. But he wasn't serious. He often joked about this. It was, they often talked about, sex and girls as, young men are wont to do, if you will. Monday morning they had talked, and Jason says he will meet Farrington an hour later to tell him how it goes. And that, yes, the two of them were courting. They were very close. They were often at the Farringtons to spend time together because the Fales would not allow Jason in and because the Fairbanks house was just chock full of people. Eliza Guild. Jason and Betsy were close, encouraged Jason not to despair over his health so he could take Betsy to the ball. Now, I will say with Eliza, Jason has expressed, it's explained that Jason had expressed to several people that he fears he will not live another 3 or 4 months. About 4 months before the death of Elizabeth, before all this happens, Jason had had a particularly serious bout of illness. He had been coughing up blood. He had been very, very ill. We know now he probably had tuberculosis, but he almost died then. And I guess he had been feeling very down, and he had mentioned to a couple of people that he felt like he was not long for this world. But Eliza said, no, don't worry. You gotta, buck up and, take Betsy to the dance, the local dance that was happening. Asa Pennyman says Jason was not more attentive to Betsy than any other. So let me stop for one moment just because I haven't been able to see if there's any, the chat window didn't stay up, any questions from anyone. So those are prosecution witnesses. Basically, while there's a lot of disagreement, they say, no, they weren't actually that close, except for the people who say they were close. And yeah, there was wounds, but we don't know exactly where the wounds were. So there's definitely some inconsistencies. Okay, so. And like I said, if you have questions, feel free to type them. I will check the chat. But let me go back into the shared screen here. So now let's talk about the defense. Joshua Fales, who's Betsy's brother, says, I never recalled Abner mentioning Jason's threats towards the family, and says that Abner's a man of truth, but has had some issues with lawsuits and bad luck. Now remember, Abner's testimony that Jason had threatened the Fales family is the prosecution's best evidence, or some of the best evidence. So one of the defense's tactics is trying to discredit Abner Whiting. Dr. Kittredge is the Fairbanks family doctor. He explains Jason's wounds, because remember, when Jason showed up at the Fales house, he was very badly wounded. He had many wounds on his chest, his abdomen, his arms, just like Betsy did. There was a large, cut on his throat, but it wasn't nearly as deep as Betsy's. And as I said, the abdominal wound was very deep and very dangerous. The abdominal wound mortified, which was their way of saying got infected. It brought on lockjaw. Jason was in a fever for 8 days. They didn't think he would survive it. Now, during all of this, those eight days he had fever, he was at the Fales house. I know, it sounds crazy, but he got to the Fales house, said Betsy needs help, and collapsed. He then fell into fever so quickly from his wounds, if they had moved him, he would have definitely died. So he is insensible and being cared for medically at the house of the family of the people, like the Fales think he killed her. He killed their daughter, but they have to have him as a house guest for over a week because he's too sick to be moved. So again, I can only imagine how awkward that was for everyone involved. Dr. Kittredge confirms Elizabeth had a wound on her left thumb. There was no wound on her right thumb. He asked to see the wound on her back, but Mrs. Lewis, who had been charged with taking care of Elizabeth's body before burial, said, no, you can't. Eunice Lewis, who is the person in charge, confirms, yes, Dr. Kittredge wanted to see the back wound. I said no. Lydia Whiting is Abner's sister. She says, Dr. Kittredge saw the back wound. He stooped down to examine it closely and said it was the greatest evidence against him, meaning she's saying that Dr. Kittredge said, this is the greatest evidence against Jason. This is very damning. And Catherine Everett basically just says, oh, I agree with Lydia. Yep, whatever Lydia said. Definitely. Yeah, I do whatever Lydia tells me to. Reuben Farrington says Dr. Kittredge wanted to see the back wound, was sorry he couldn't. So again, we have the person in charge of the body and a friend and the doctor himself saying, I wanted to see the back wound. And then the sister of Abner Whiting is like, oh, he saw it. He said it was super trouble for Jason. Ebenezer Jr., Jason's brother, says Dr. Kittredge and I were with Jason. We were not present with the jury at Betsy's examination. In other words, Dr. Kittredge could not have seen the back wound then, and he was told no when he asked later. Edward Sisk also says, yep, Dr. Kittredge didn't see the back wound. Suki Fairbanks, Susanna Davis, who's Jason's niece, again, that's Ebenezer Jr.'s adult daughter. She says she's the one who wrote the fake marriage certificate. Jason and Betsy were often together. They were tender, they were intimate. They were alone together for a night. And then Betsy said to Suki, I want to tell you something, but I can't because my sister Polly is here. And she never got a chance to find out what Elizabeth wanted to tell her. So the implication there being that maybe Jason and Betsy had basically hooked up and she wanted to gossip to a friend about it, but she wouldn't say anything in front of her sister. Suki also agrees, just reminds everyone Jason was very sick and weakly. She says, we tussled once and I held him easily. It took him hours to recover. And also, she saw him use the borrowed knife to mend a pen. So in other words, there are some people saying that if this was premeditated and he had asked for the knife so he could go kill her. And Suki is saying, no, I saw him. He asked to borrow the knife because he actually wanted to mend a pen. Jason's brother comes back up and says he was very weak, unable to work, especially since that illness several months ago that I had mentioned, and he needed help even dressing and undressing, very weak. Jason and Betsy were fond, but Jason didn't really talk to his older brother about feelings, so Ebenezer Jr. couldn't really say anything one way or another on that. And Jason had written some music Monday morning, and he needed a pen for that, and he needed to repair the pen with the penknife. So again, just confirming that he had the penknife for legitimate reasons. Betsy's father claims he never refused Jason from the house. And Jason's uncle, Samuel, says Jason and Betsy were fond of each other and often together. William Draper, we're back to trying to discredit Abner. Abner Whiting had issues, was troubled in his mind 8 or 9 years ago. In fact, just this week, Abner told me he had said something wrong before the grand jury and thought he might get in trouble. Dr. Metcalf says Jason almost didn't survive his wounds. At one point, he said he didn't want to survive his wounds because his friend was dead. And Betsy had a wound on her left thumb. I'm telling you, no one can agree about this thumb. It's crazy. Mary Whiting is Abner and Lydia's mother. Dr. Kittredge said the back wound was the greatest evidence against him. Now, first of all, her statement in which that line is included is eerily similar to her daughter Lydia's. Like, so similar that it almost sounds practiced. Like the identical testimony. So that's a little suspicious. So she says, Dr. Kittredge said the back wound was the greatest evidence against him, but then says Dr. Kittredge never told me he had seen the wound. So basically she's saying, well, I didn't see him see the wound and he didn't tell me he saw the wound, but I know he did just because I know, apparently. And she says, oh no, Jason and Betsy had no intimacy. They barely knew each other. So going to the closing statements. The defense counsel gives a stirring speech about the jurors' obligation to discount rumor and the exaggeration that often accompanies a case where emotions run high. And that's still the case now, where you aren't supposed to listen to rumor, you have to look at facts, but you are supposed to let reasonable doubt be the deciding factor. And then again, as I say, that's still the case today, where if there is reasonable doubt that this person may not have done this, then you should not convict. That is what jurors are instructed to do. Jason had no motive to kill Betsy, again, according to the defense. And the defense offers a more likely scenario. They say the relationship was like a smothered flame, leading Betsy to self-harm. And to quote the defense counsel says, is it not more likely that a passionate young woman harms herself in grief at the impossibility of them being together than that a sickly but devoted young man kills the object of his love? If he was the murderer, he was neither impelled by anger, by jealousy, by avarice, or by lust. Not an angry word had escaped the lips of either of them. So it's saying he had no reason to kill her, he wouldn't want to do so. Wouldn't it make more sense that she had done this to herself because she was so heartbroken over them not being able to be married? If Jason was planning this, says the defense, he would not have told people he was meeting Betsy. He would have kept it secret. His talk of gratifying desires was obviously bluster. He had had plenty of time alone with Betsy over the 2 to 3 previous years. And in fact, earlier, one of the witnesses was both Betsy's sister said, oh, they were together for at least an hour, and we went to their house at night. And Suki Davis, Jason's niece, says, yeah, they were together alone the whole night. So they had opportunity to be together. The Farringtons all agree they used to come to their house and spend time together. So saying that, you know, in other words, the defense is saying, you know, the prosecution says he might have killed her because she rejected his advances and he tried to rape her. And the defense is saying if he was going to do something like that, it would have been 2 to 3 years earlier. The testimony of threats made is months, years old, and only shows how deeply he grieved not being approved for Betsy. Abner's testimony is confused and contradictory, and if it was true, why didn't Abner say something then? And also, if this was planned, Jason had access to much better weapons than a small broken penknife. Even Dr. Ames, publicly not a fan of the Fairbankses, agrees the backstab wound could have been self-inflicted. Now, both the defense and the prosecution like to get a little dramatic, which I find amusing, because the defense is saying, well, she could have done it herself. And of course, you might say, well, even if she could have stabbed herself in the back, why would one stab themselves in the back? And the defense says it was to stop the pain in her heart. Her heart was so broken that she stabbed herself in the back to stop the pain in her heart. I don't know if that logic really fully follows through, but we'll give them their fancy there. The majority of Betsy's wounds were on her left side. Jason does not have use of his right arm, and Betsy is right-handed. Therefore, it would be more plausible, they say, for Betsy to have wounded herself on her left side with her right arm than for Jason, because if they're facing each other, Jason's right arm would be on Betsy's left side, but he can't use his right arm. So they are saying the fact that most of her wounds are on the left side suggests she did it to herself. The wide variety of wounds might seem strange, but Jason had a similarly wide variety of wounds, and we all agree those were definitely self-inflicted. So again here, they're saying the debate is whether Jason hurt Betsy or Betsy hurt herself. Everyone agrees Jason hurt himself. His motivations for why are up in the air, but his wounds are self-inflicted, although the prosecution says some of his wounds were from her fighting back. But we know definitely the throat and the stomach were self-inflicted. The cries of distress overheard were emotional rather than physical pain. If it was physical, it would have been stronger words than, oh dear, which frankly I agree with. If you're being murdered, generally one would say something stronger than, oh dear, oh dear. I can think of a few things I would say, and none of them are appropriate to repeat here, and it would not be oh dear. The false certificate, which the prosecution loved to bring up over and over again, was him innocently, it was a joke, it was shown to Betsy in jest, and anyway, Betsy would have known it was fake because the prosecution tried to claim that Jason tried to use it to force her into marriage or into sex, saying, oh, well, we're married now, so you have to do what I say, or something to that effect. But the defense says, no, she would have known it was fake. It was an intent to be published. If it was real and it had been published, she would have seen it in the local paper. Jason had showed it to her, says the defense, saying he feared the forgery was as close as they would get to ever actually being married. And this is what sent Betsy into her frenzy. She tore it up in her sadness, and that's when she began to injure herself. Now, I love this. This is when the defense gets really dramatic. Murder is not usually committed in the countryside midday in sunshine, as guilt invariably shuns the light. And that is my favorite statement ever for why someone could not have murdered someone else. Clearly, Jason could not have murdered her because no one ever murders anyone in the daylight, apparently. So that's, again, this is in 1801, when you're a lawyer, you speak very flowery and you have grand gestures and statements. And so don't worry, the prosecution has an equally wonderful one in just a few slides. It was unlikely for Jason to murder Betsy in an open pasture within view of her father's house. So you could see the pasture from the Fales' house. You couldn't really see into it. There were apparently some bushes, some shrubs around it, but the site of the pasture was visible from the Fales' house. And the penknife is small enough that mortal wounds would require either massive strength, which we all know Jason definitely didn't have, or cooperation of the victim. And if they supposedly struggled for 15 minutes, which was how long they heard the cries of distress of, oh dear, how could weak Jason hold on to her for that whole time? If he could have, her clothing would have been more disordered. So if a weak boy, because Elizabeth by all accounts is actually stronger than Jason because of his illness. So how can he hold on to her for 15 whole minutes? And if they were struggling that much, then her clothing would have been more torn or ripped, or especially if he had tried to rape her, it wouldn't just be her shoes and shawl that were taken off. Jason's own suicide attempt shows his innocence. If he was guilty, he would have run off and dumped the knife, not gone to the Fales house for help. And a reminder that he's always been weak, especially after that illness 4 months ago where he coughed up blood. And in fact, just 10 days before this incident, he lost a tussle with a 4-year-old relative, which I'm sure Jason was thrilled to have announced to everyone. I mean, at that point, he probably didn't care that much, but kind of an embarrassing story to be told when you can't beat your 4-year-old relative. The many inconsistencies in testimonies should cause great doubt in jurors. So now let's move on to the prosecution's closing statement. Jason had the knife and was the only person present with Betsy, so no one else could have done it. She had no reason to kill herself. If she wanted to marry Jason, she could have. Again, remember, Betsy's father claims he never stopped Jason from coming over, that he had no problem with Jason. So, you know, Elizabeth was a grown woman. I mean, she was 18, but that time a legal adult, and she could have married Jason if she wanted to. And if she were to commit suicide, this is their dramatic moment, it would not be like this. For when it comes to women, it is always preceded by melancholy, and women generally avoid the ghastly wounds of the knife and dagger. 1801 logic, I love it. Women don't commit suicide unless they've been visibly melancholy ahead of time, and then they use poison or strangling because the knife or dagger is too bloody and too much for women who are killing themselves, I guess. They're saying Betsy was virtuous. She probably died in defense of her honor, and she couldn't have given herself those wounds. She would not cut her own thumb or the tendons in her arm. The thumb, I don't know. I feel like if you're handling a knife, it would be very easy to slip and cut your thumb, and besides which, no one can agree on that darn thumb. But the tendons in your arm, it would be difficult, I think, to cut them yourself. Certainly, it would cause a great deal of pain. The Attorney General, remember, the guy who loves to hear himself speak, then goes on at length regarding the state of education in the country and idleness and the path of life. And he gives this whole pages and pages of talking about the state of the world and how Jason's a product of his time, because basically it boils down to kids these days, no respect. You should be out on a porch yelling at children for being on his lawn or something like that. And he says, perhaps Jason didn't go in planning to murder her, but he intended to have his way with her, and when she tore the fake certificate, it drove him to rage. Also, he claims that Jason's infirmity is not an issue, that he stabbed Elizabeth in the back, and then as she turned, he stabbed at her chest and her throat, and her arms were damaged in her defense of those vital areas, which is plausible. That is the only way he would have been able to do this, is if he had stabbed her in the back and then cut at her as she turned around. So again, perfectly plausible, but remember the defense statements about how very weak he was and how could they have struggled for that long. Now, the defense had suggested maybe there was a suicide pact. Jason always denied this, never agreed to it, but it was something that his lawyers had put forth. But prosecution says even if there was, he'd still be culpable for trying to convince her to kill herself or trying to lead her to suicide. And if it was self-inflicted harm, what was Jason doing? Was he just standing there the whole time? Great question. If your girlfriend is murdering herself in front of you, one would expect you would do something, no? Yeah, so it's a great question. Also saying Elizabeth had no motive to kill herself. His inability to labor, unexcitement about the arts and sciences, and overindulgence of his parents made him weak in character and unable to stop negative inclinations and uncontrollable obstinacy. So again, he goes back into how Jason just is has a poor character. He's saying Jason only wanted to ruin Betsy to get revenge on her parents, and that she would not have agreed to ruining her chastity, so he must have planned on raping her. And that the fact that he went to the Fales house instead of running away does not prove innocence, as the defense claimed. He knew there were witnesses who could place him at the scene and knew running would make him look guilty. Maybe he did intend to kill himself, or maybe he just wounded himself enough to substantiate his story. If that was the case, he really overdid it since he came very close to dying from those wounds. But they're saying that this was not him trying to kill himself in grief. This was just, trying to wound himself and then have that, make him look better or less guilty. If it was an actual suicide attempt, it's only because he had no hope of escape or he felt guilty. So maybe he didn't try to commit suicide, he was just faking it, or even if he did, it was just because he felt bad. Now, despite the fact that at the beginning of the trial, the prosecution reminds the jurors about how they have to try to be impartial and how they have to, think about reasonable doubt, and the defense reminding them about the whole reasonable doubt thing, the prosecutor, Attorney General, then says, remember that even when evidence seems circumstantial, it isn't always, as witnesses must be taken at their word and feeling and experience must be taken into account. So even if the evidence seems circumstantial, you can believe it anyway, I guess. He says much circumstantial evidence may be seen as fact. He gives an example, saying if a man fires a gun and another man standing nearby falls down dead of a gunshot wound, then it is circumstantial that the first man killed the second. It's not definite because maybe there was someone standing off to the side who you couldn't see and they fired at the same time or something to that effect. But he's saying, so that you could say that was circumstantial, but obviously if one man shoots a gun and the man near him dies of a gunshot wound, then you can take it as fact that man A shot man B. This is him saying, sometimes if the circumstantial evidence is strong enough, it counts as fact. So, the final results of the trial. The jury deliberates for only 2 to 3 hours. There's 1 hour at night and a little bit of time the following morning. So despite all of the conflicting testimony, despite the craziness, they don't deliberate for very long. The verdict of guilty is unanimous. Asterisk here is because Ebenezer Jr., Jason's brother, claims that within a few days of the trial, a couple of the jurors claimed they had felt pressured, they weren't sure about the verdict they had given, maybe, if they were asked again now, they'd give a different answer. No one else can substantiate this, but Ebenezer Jr. believes it quite fervently. And the judge sentences Jason to death by hanging. So, let me, again, stop sharing for a moment just to check and see if anyone has any questions at this time. If there's any questions about the trial or any confusion so far before we go into the next stage. Because normally in a situation like this, someone is convicted and sentenced to death and then they go to jail and then they're executed. But this situation gets complicated. So any questions at the moment? No? All right, I'll go back into. So, the prison escape. The night of August 17th, and the trial, by the way, took place at the beginning of August. Jason escapes from prison with the help of his brother, Ebenezer Jr., and a few of his friends. A flyer is put out the next day, and again, another wonderful example of early 1800s drama, public drama. The stain of blood is upon the land. Jason Fairbanks, the murderer, has escaped. We cannot tell where to look for him. We must look everywhere. Therefore, we agree and submit to 3 things: that our houses and premises shall be searched, that we will give an account of ourselves and our inmates during the night past and this day, and that we will exert ourselves in every way to apprehend the culprit and his accomplices. No honest man's eyes must sleep in Dedham this night. A bounty is put out. This is what the bounty flyer basically looked like. It was put forth by Benjamin Cutler, the sheriff of Dedham. It was originally a $500 bounty. It is increased to $1,000 through subscriptions in Boston. Basically, they go to the wealthy people in Boston and say, you know, oh, there's a murderer on the loose. Don't you want to help, you know, catch this famed murderer and make sure the streets of Boston are safe? And so they get wealthy people in Boston to donate enough to raise it to $1,000. This is certainly, up till that time, one of the largest bounties ever seen. Remember, this is 1801. $1,000 in 1801 is over $20,000 today, like $20,000, 600 and some odd number. So think about like $20,000 bounty. It was very big. But keep in mind, part of the reason the bounty is so big is that this was nationwide. Obviously, it impacted Dedham the most, but this was, I like to say, it was the O.J. Simpson trial of 1801, of the 1800s. Everyone knew about this. It was countrywide. All of New England, and in fact, all of the country was following the story, had read about it in the newspapers. So the fact that Jason escaped was not only very dramatic and gathered a lot of interest, but also Sheriff Cutler was extremely invested in catching this guy, because otherwise he would go down in history as the sheriff who let the famous murderer escape. So just keep in mind, this was not a simple Dedham matter. This was everyone talking about this. Okay, let's see here.
Allison, we just had a question.
Yeah,
Somebody wanted to know where the jail was located.
The Dedham jail was actually located right down the street from where the Dedham Public Library is right now. I forget what the name of the street is, but it's a big stone building, and I think it's an apartment complex now. But it was the Dedham jail for a long time, and actually the Dedham jail was pretty famous because they had this breakout. It was the place where Sacco and Vanzetti were held before their trial. So it's right in downtown Dedham.
Okay, thanks. We have another question?
Sure.
Okay, somebody asked, were the jurors from Dedham or Norfolk County? And would they have actually known the families personally?
That is a great question that I am not sure about. I think they probably weren't family friends, but the population was small enough and the Fairbanks were prominent enough that even if they were from Norfolk County in general rather than just Dedham, they would have at least been familiar with the family and were probably familiar with the whole Benjamin Fairbanks Sedition Acts situation. So that's why, you know, I explained the whole thing about Benjamin, because it's very unlikely that even if they were taken from further out in Norfolk, they would have, you know, it's unlikely they would not have known about this, what was going on with the Fairbanks family.
Okay, thanks.
And I don't know for sure. I'm sorry about that. So Jason's friends and his brother Ebenezer Jr. put him on a horse, and Henry Ducombe, who is a friend of Ebenezer Jr.'s, head west and then north. So they head west across Massachusetts and then north up into Vermont to Lake Champlain. On Sunday, August 23rd, they are apprehended between 8 and 9 a.m. So Henry Ducombe has already, actually, let's see here. So Henry Ducombe chartered a boat for $15 to go to Canada. The bags were on board. The crew was getting ready to go. Jason was literally just eating some breakfast while waiting for the crew to allow the passengers to board. He was literally steps from getting away. Once he'd crossed into Canada, he probably would have been home free. So he came very close to actually escaping and making it. Now, when he's captured by the gentleman listed in the second bullet point here, Henry Tisdale, Mr. Moses, Seth Wheelock, they all said that when they caught up with him, he seemed to be acting kind of strangely, that he was oddly calm, almost to the point of being insensible. He seemed a little dazed and surprised that they had pursued him so far. So we don't know if he was unaware of how public his trial, how public the situation was, or if he was just being off. Because a few people mention that, you know, up until the execution, Jason was acting a little bit off. And we'll discuss possible reasons for that later. But they do mention that he comes very quietly with no resistance, and he's kind of got this attitude of like, oh, you guys came all this way for me? So we don't know how much news he was getting when he was in prison of how big this was. So Jason and Dukem were both brought to the Boston jail because obviously the Dedham jail wasn't quite secure enough. It wasn't a jail, wasn't like a Shawshank Redemption style jailbreak where they tunneled through a wall or something. I believe that the one prison guard had been either bribed or incapacitated somehow. So, you know, so they were brought to the Boston jail where, you know, the jailer wasn't maybe a friend of Ebenezer Jr.'s. And the governor issues a warrant for the execution to be on Thursday, September 10th, between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. A later investigation shows the people involved, so Jason's brother and friends, and a couple of them are acquitted. One of them is sentenced to 2 months in jail, and Ebenezer and Sisk get 4 months in jail. We don't have a record of when that was served or if that was served, but that's what they were sentenced for. So, the execution. This is a map of Dedham currently. So where my cursor's over right now, this is Dedham Center. You know, downtown Dedham, where it's High Street and Eastern Ave meet. You know, there's the CVS there and Big Bear Coffee House and all that. And as you go down High Street, you get to the Dedham Courthouse, which is where the court case took place. Although it actually, so many people tried to get into the courthouse to see it, they ended up moving it to the meeting house. If you continue down High Street, you will come to a triangle of land with no buildings on it. That is Dedham Commons. I should say that's what's left of Dedham Commons. It used to be bigger, but that's what the commons were. Most towns had a common, which was common grazing area. So anyone in the town could bring their animals there to graze, you know, to get some exercise. And so the Dedham's Commons used to be bigger, but that's what's left of it, that triangle. And that is where the hanging took place. So on September 10th, Jason walks from Boston to Dedham, accompanied by Dr. Reverend Thatcher. Dr. Thatcher had been visiting Jason in prison in the time leading up to the execution. So the, you know, couple weeks between the escape and the execution. And he had encouraged Jason to repent, to get right with God, to think about his sins. But he says Jason never changed his story, and we'll talk about Jason's side of the story in a moment. But that Jason did the entire time act a little off. So Jason's escorted by the sheriff of Suffolk County to the county line, where he is received by the sheriff of Norfolk County and the Roxbury troop of horse. So this is one sickly kid, and he's got like a maximum security prisoner exchange thing going on. It was very dramatic. He's brought to the Dedham jail and he's searched. A knife is found on him, which he admits was given to him to end his own life. But he will not say who gave it to him or why he didn't want to use it. He's escorted to the town common by 100 volunteer guard. Now, there were actually about 300 people in Dedham who volunteered to be the guard. They only needed 100 of them to escort this one guy, but it turns out the other 200 were needed for crowd control. The population of Dedham in 1801 was 2,000 people. 10,000 showed up to the execution. The town was packed. Someone mentions, you know, counting 1,200 carriages go down High Street that day. And I mean, it was just this massive crowd of people. So they were, a lot of the soldiers, you know, and volunteers who had shown up, ended up just being crowd control just because of the number of people. And again, that's just reaffirming the whole, this was much bigger than just a town of Dedham thing. If you were able to get to Dedham that day, you did. It was the place to be. On the way to the green, and once he was there, several people noted that Jason, again, was doing that thing where he was kind of off, he was too calm, kind of acting uncaring about what was happening, or maybe not really understanding what was happening, that they were just concerned about his mental state. And that the insensible that on the walk, I will say, while he was on that walk and seeming insensible, he apparently was asking after people in the crowd, kind of like, oh, is that so-and-so? Oh, yeah, oh, hey, look, it's so-and-so. Not the common, actions and attitude of someone on their way to the gallows. Just before 3 p.m., Jason was asked if he had any final words. He said no. He was to give a signal when he was ready. The sheriff gives him a handkerchief and he's supposed to drop it or throw it aside when he's ready. And pretty much as soon as he's handed it, he drops it. He's ready. He hasn't anything to say. He dies by hanging and is buried in the family plot in Dedham, actually only a few rows away from Elizabeth. So they're both buried in the cemetery that is behind St. Paul's Church in Dedham, the village cemetery. And they are both there, and you can still see both of their headstones, only a few rows away from each other. So let's talk about what Jason actually said, because we've heard what the prosecution says, and we've heard what the defense says. What Jason says is, and again, this is a declaration he dictated to his jailers to be read after his death. I met Elizabeth Fales at an early age, eventually paid my address, and was received as a favored lover for a year in harmony with her family. But one night, I made a tasteless joke which offended her sister Clarissa, who then turned Betsy's parents against me, and they alienated me on the basis of one bad joke. For those who are curious, the joke was something to the effect of Clarissa mentioned someone coming over, a man she was fond of, and Jason says something to the effect of, oh, I knew he was coming over because you went and got that bottle of brandy. So he makes a joke about a guy Clarissa liking alcohol too much. Later, someone in Dedham published a piece ridiculing Mrs. Fales and Clarissa, and while I said I would purchase it, I was in no way involved with its creation or publication, despite rumors and Fales believing it so. Betsy and I separated for a year, hoping the enmity would die down, but it didn't. Betsy admitted she was still in love with me, and we resumed our relationship, though she said she could not invite me to her father's house, and we must meet elsewhere. We saw each other often, outdoors until the weather was bad, and then at friends' houses. And when I was ill, she would come stay at my house with me. Just the Wednesday before her death, she stayed the night with me and said how much she wished we could be married, and agreed to meet Monday afternoon. There was never a suicide pact. We met that day for conversation. We talked about the subject of our marriage, and it occurred to me I had the certificate written by my niece. He had just gotten it from her the night before this. And he gives the same story as Suki, that he didn't ask for her name. He said, oh, just write me something with any of the Dedham girls. And Suki was the one who said, shall I put in Betsy Fales? I read the certificate to Betsy, saying I feared this was as close to marriage as we would get. And then I tore it up, telling her I wished to be married in truth. I asked her to go away with me then to be married, but that she would then return to her father's house, so I could not support her. So basically, he wants to run away to Rentham to get married, but because he's been ill and hasn't, unable to work, he cannot support her right now. So he's saying, well, go get married. That way it's a done deal. Your parents can't do anything about it, but then you need to go back and live at your father's house for a while till I can support you. And she doesn't like that. She cried, saying she'd be disowned and shamed, and that I could not love her, and spoke of how often her sisters and Mrs. Whiting told her I did not truly love her. I feel terrible about it now, but I said that if she wants to believe Mrs. Whiting and her sisters, remember the Whitings, that Abner, Lydia, that whole family, she can go to the devil with them, since she knew I had already possessed her person and received the pledge of her most tender attachment. In 1801, to go to the devil with you was actually a fairly strong curse. And certainly he's suggesting here that the two of them had been intimate already. kind of taking the wind out of the prosecution's sails of the whole he wanted to violate her chastity or whatnot. She demanded to know if I told anyone of our relationship, and I admitted I had told a couple of my dearest friends. She said I was a monster. Again, I feel like that suggests that yes, they had slept together, because if it was just that they had kissed or something, she wouldn't care so much that he had told people. During our conversation, I had been whittling a small piece of wood with a penknife, and she cried, "Give me that knife, I will put an end to my existence, you false-hearted man, for I had rather die than live." She grabbed the knife and began randomly stabbing herself while walking away from me. I was struck with astonishment and frozen in a place in a state of insensibility, but was startled back to awareness when she came back over and almost fell on me. I saw then that her throat was cut, so I immediately grabbed the knife and stabbed myself repeatedly and cut my own throat, intending to die myself. That is actually a copy of the statement dictated by Jason. The Fairbanks family has it. It's in their collections in their office. And it is actually the statement he dictated from jail. And he finishes with, "Thus have I, in my last weak state, given a true and faithful account of all these affecting circumstances which have brought my youth to its most unhappy downfall. It is my remaining hope that the view of my sad destiny may prove a warning to all young people, and likewise to every parent, not to ruin themselves and destroy their children for the sake of mere self-gratification." So as any dramatic young 20-year-old man would do, he pretty much finishes by saying, "Betsy's parents, this is on you. Look what you did." So kind of twist the knife a little bit there for them. No pun intended there. So the aftermath. The trial remains major news for months. A publication of the court transcript goes through 4 editions in 4 months, sells thousands of copies. Ebenezer Jr. spends the rest of his life and a great deal of money self-publishing essays and trying to convince the public of his late brother's innocence and repair the tarnished character. But Jason was long ago tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Public opinion remains very negative, and the Fairbanks family reputation suffers. They already took a hit with the whole Benjamin Fairbanks thing. This is a much bigger hit to their reputation. Ebenezer Jr.'s daughters, who do get married, all find spouses outside of Dedham, and the 3 daughters remain unmarried because the family fortune is gone, there's no dowry, and the family name is in the trash. Though this worked out well for the Fairbanks family in general, because the fact that they lost the family fortune meant they couldn't afford to update the house, as most Victorians love to do, with all the fancy new gadgets and electricity and indoor plumbing and all this great stuff, and they couldn't afford to do any of that, which is why the Fairbanks house remains such a unique example of first period living, because it remains pretty much unchanged in the early 1800s. But could there be another explanation? So it's either she killed herself and he tried to follow her, or he killed her and then tried to fall out of guilt. But Dale H. Freeman in the 90s suggested, what if Jason suffered from mercury poisoning? Many of his symptoms of illness and weakness match with that diagnosis, and the insensibility mentioned several times does also. People suffering from mercury poisoning can seem very strange, very out of it, confused, and act oddly. Another symptom of mercury poisoning is sudden rages and memory blackouts. Now, Jason had never been reported to have these behaviors, but it's not impossible to have happened. Could Jason have had an adrenaline-fueled mercury poisoning rage that gave him enough strength to overpower Betsy, and then maybe he legitimately didn't remember it? Who knows? Despite there existing some measure of doubt and Ebenezer Jr.'s efforts, Jason remains guilty in the public eye for centuries. In fact, even today, Google search results find all articles and sources listing him as a murderer, and the word alleged is never seen, except on the few I've been able to go edit myself, like Wikipedia. I hope no one's changed it back. I think it's very unfair because I believe there is a significant amount of reasonable doubt. I don't think he would have been convicted in 2020 with no one agreeing on where the wounds were and exactly what happened and all these things. But then again, in 2020, we'd have forensics and photography, and so that would certainly change things quite a bit in terms of witnesses and evidence. So if you're ever interested in speaking with me about this, you have any questions you think of after tonight, feel free to email me. A lot of my research was done with this book, A Massachusetts Mystery. The first half of the book is the transcript of the court trial. And then the second half, and then there's Jason's statement is printed out, and then the rest of it is Ebenezer Jr.'s statements. And again, I said a couple slides ago, Ebenezer Jr. spent a lot of time and money the rest of his life publishing essays and trying to prove Jason's innocence and talk about his character and how he was such a good person and he was studious and he wanted to be better than he was, and he lamented the fact that he couldn't work and all this stuff. So a lot of Ebenezer Jr.'s writings are in this book also. I believe I know you can get it through the Fairbanks House gift shop, and I think maybe also at the Dedham Historical Society and Museum gift shop, I believe. So let me stop that. Oh, what do I believe happened? Great question. I don't know. I'm very torn. I don't think that he just killed her because she wouldn't sleep with him. I think if he did kill her, it would have had more to do with him possibly being mentally ill or suffering from mercury poisoning than, you know, him actually wanting her dead. But I think it's possible that she did injure herself. Maybe it's not plausible though. Even if you could reach this far in the middle of your back to stab yourself, you probably wouldn't. If you wanted to stab yourself because your heart was broken, you'd go through your chest. I mean, as much as there is reasonable doubt, logically it seems like it would be more likely that he had done it. But I'm just not sure of that because there's just too much up in the air, and the people who didn't have it out for the Fairbanks basically all agreed that they wanted to be together, and that Jason wished he could do better for her. So I guess if I had to say, I would say he did it but wasn't aware of doing it maybe. But his statement is so very certain that he just froze. I can also see if someone you love started harming themselves, you might just freeze up and, what are you doing? You know, oh my gosh, what do I do? That's plausible too. So that's what fascinates me about this, is that I just don't know, and we'll never know, which is frustrating, but also fascinating. What was that here? Do I think someone else did the deed? No evidence suggests anyone else having been there or been nearby. Jason never said it or anything else. The Fales house is not still there. The abandoned house across from the Endicott estate that is burned out is the location of the Fales house, but that is not, the house that is burned there is not the house that it was rebuilt later. It was not the Fales house, but it is that property. But it remains a really fascinating story just because none of it makes sense. Her killing herself doesn't make sense. Him killing her doesn't make sense. But no one else was ever suggested to have been there, and nothing else could have happened. So that's what got me so into this topic, is just that, you know, we'll never really know. So thank you all so much for joining me. I know I'm just a little past 8 here. Sorry for running over by a couple minutes, but I'll stick around a few more minutes for any questions. And I hope you all enjoyed this. And again, I really encourage you to get your hands on this book if you're interested, and to visit the locations in Dedham that show interest and check out the Fairbanks house. So thank you all.
Thank you, Allison. Oh, someone has, a lot of people are saying that they really enjoyed it. Did the jailbreak involve an insider?
We're not sure if the guard may have been an acquaintance of Ebenezer Jr. who was paid to look the other way, or if they incapacitated the guard. They definitely didn't kill anyone, and the guard himself was not one of the people who was charged with the helping Jason escape, but he may have been not completely innocent in all of it either. Have you read Dale Freeman's account? Yes. Yeah, actually. Yeah. Yeah. So for Daniel Gavin, yeah, actually, that was my positive. What I actually think might have happened was perhaps he was in a mercury poisoning fueled adrenaline rage. I mean, that's really the only thing that would have given him enough strength to overpower Elizabeth. But yes, the Dale H. Freeman account, I encourage you to look into it, anyone who is unfamiliar with it, because he's the one who came up with the mercury poisoning idea. And it is, mercury poisoning is not something they were aware of then, but it is something that we know about now. And it certainly, even if it wasn't a mercury poisoning issue that, you know, made him kill her or something, certainly it seems the mercury poisoning is likely why he was acting so strange afterward. That how they kept talking about how he was just weirdly uncaring or insensible, that clearly he was suffering ill effects physically. Thank you. Yeah, no, Dedham has such amazing history. And it's so special that the first public school, the oldest wood frame structure, I mean, the wonderful things they have at the Dedham Historical Society and Museum. Dedham is fantastically lucky in its historical richness. And it really is. It really is.
Well, that consensus is that was a great program. I totally concur. And thank you so much, Allison. If anybody has any other questions for Allison, feel free to email her. Otherwise, thank you again for coming.
In case anyone missed it, I'm just going to throw my email address in the chat. So it's just AllisonFneff@gmail.com. Love to hear from people. If you have any ideas of your own or further questions, I'd love to try to help if I can. But it's a really fascinating topic, and I'm interested in what you all think happened. So if anyone wants to reach out and let me know or tell me here, we'll see what the 2020 public opinion is.
Yeah, it's anyone's guess, I guess.
If you see anything online and it just says Jason's a murderer, see if you can get them to change it to alleged murderer. I don't like it when they just assume he was automatically guilty. In all fairness, he was tried and convicted and hanged. So, I mean, I guess that's, you know, usually enough for someone to say, yeah, they did it, but I just don't feel it.
Too much reasonable doubt.
Yeah, I just, you know, no one could even agree on where her thumb was. I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah. I love the drama of the court case that, oh, a woman uses poison or strangling. A woman can't handle hurting herself with a knife, or the murder doesn't happen in the daytime. Cruel acts of murder shun the light. It's fantastic.
Well, you have examined this case inside and out, haven't you? You've
Yes.
left no stone unturned in your description of it. So
that's a great one. There's always more stones to turn, but I've turned as many of them as I can so far.
All right. Thanks again, Allison. That was terrific.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and letting me share.
Wonderful having you.